The smell of morning coffee was still steaming from my mug when I stepped onto my deck and saw them. Two identical women in bright yellow rain jackets setting up a private property sign right on my dock. Not near it, not beside it. Right on the wooden planks I'd hammered together with my own hands 2 years ago. I blinked hard, thinking maybe I was still dreaming. But no, there they were, the Clark sisters, looking like matching roadwork cones as they drilled holes into my dock. "Morning, trespasser," Debbie called out, not even bothering to look up from her power drill. The sound cut through the morning air like a dentist's tool. "This pier doesn't belong to you anymore." That's when I knew my quiet retirement by the lake was over. I walked down to the water's edge, my bare feet crunching on the gravel path I'd laid stone by stone. "Ladies, I think there's been some mistake. This is my property." Donna, the second twin, straightened up and brushed imaginary dust off her jacket. She had the same platinum blonde hair as her sister, the same sharp nose, the same cold smile. "Oh, we know exactly who you are, Mr. Federal Agent Man." I reached into my back pocket and pulled out my badge. Old habits. Even 3 years into retirement, the weight of it still felt natural in my palm. "Then you know I'm not someone you want to mess with." Both sisters started laughing, not giggling, full-blown cackling, like I just told them the funniest joke they'd ever heard. "Honey," Debbie said, wiping fake tears from her eyes, "we've been expecting you to try that little trick. That's exactly why we're here." The sound of a truck engine made me turn around. A white security van was pulling up to my house, and 2 men in gray uniforms were getting out. Not local police, private security with Lakeside Protection printed on their shirts. "What the hell is this?" I asked, but I already knew I wasn't going to like the answer. 24/7 protection of private waterfront property, Donna said, pointing to a new chain and padlock they'd attached to my dock posts. "You see, this entire shoreline has been reclassified as community property under the new district ordinance." "What new ordinance?" Debbie pulled out a folded paper from her jacket pocket. "Filed last Tuesday, effective immediately. All waterfront access points within the Pine Grove District are now regulated by the Homeowners Association for the safety and enjoyment of all residents." I snatched the paper from her hands. The legal language was thick as mud, but the bottom line was crystal clear. My dock was now considered public access, and they had the authority to control who could use it. "This is insane," I muttered, scanning the document. "You can't just take someone's property." "We're not taking it," Donna said sweetly. "We're protecting it for everyone." One of the security guards approached us, his hand resting on his radio. "Is there a problem here, ladies?" "Yes," Debbie said, pointing directly at me. "This gentleman is attempting to access private waterfront property without authorization." I looked at the guard, a young guy with nervous eyes who was clearly out of his depth. "Son, this is my dock. I built it myself. Check the property records." The guard looked between me, the twins, and his radio. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step back from the water line." "You've got to be kidding me." "Step back, sir." That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a megaphone crackling to life. The second guard had positioned himself near my house and was now broadcasting to the entire neighborhood. "Attention residents. We have a federal agent attempting to violate private property boundaries. Please stay in your homes for your safety." The words hit me like a physical blow. Every curtain in every house around the lake twitched. Every neighbor I'd waved to for 3 years was now watching me get treated like a criminal on my own property. Have you ever felt the exact moment when your quiet life explodes? When everything you thought was solid ground suddenly turns to quicksand under your feet? That megaphone announcement wasn't just embarrassing, it was the opening shot of a war I didn't even know I was fighting. The megaphone fell silent, but the damage was already spreading through the neighborhood like spilled gasoline. I could see faces pressed against windows, neighbors stepping onto their porches with coffee cups frozen halfway to their lips. Mrs. Henderson from across the lake had her phone out, probably already texting the neighborhood group chat. The Johnsons next door were standing on their deck, whispering and pointing. 3 years of morning waves and friendly conversations, gone in 30 seconds of that security guard's announcement. Satisfied, I asked the Clark sisters, but they were already packing up their drill and folding their paperwork with the efficiency of people who'd done this before. "Have a blessed day, Mr. Patterson," Debbie said, climbing into a white SUV I hadn't noticed before. "We'll see you at the emergency meeting tonight." What meeting? But they were already driving away, leaving me standing there with 2 security guards and a chain-locked dock that used to be mine. The younger guard shifted his weight nervously. "Sir, I'm really sorry about this, but I have to follow orders. You can't approach the waterline." "Whose orders? Who's paying you?" He glanced at his partner, an older guy with gray temples who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Pine Grove Homeowners Association, sir. They hired us to protect community assets." Community assets. My dock was now a community asset. I walked back to my house, feeling every pair of eyes in the neighborhood tracking my movement. The gravel under my feet sounded different now, sharper, angrier. Even my own property felt foreign. Inside, I grabbed my phone and dialed the county clerk's office. If there really was some new ordinance, I needed to see the original filing. "County records, this is Janet." "Janet, this is Robert Patterson. I need to check on a recent ordinance filing for Pine Grove District. Something about waterfront property." "Hey, hold on, honey." I could hear typing in the background. "Ordinance 2024-157, filed September 10th. Community Waterfront Access and Safety Regulation." September 10th, 5 days ago. Who filed it? Let's see. Looks like it was submitted by the Pine Grove Homeowners Association. Debbie Clark, president. Of course it was. "Janet, can you fax me a copy of the complete filing? I need to see the supporting documentation." "Sure thing. Give me your number." 20 minutes later, my fax machine was spitting out 12 pages of the most creative legal fiction I'd ever seen. According to the Clark sisters' filing, my dock posed a navigational hazard to other watercraft. It blocked traditional community access routes that had existed since the 1960s. Most impressive of all, it violated environmental safety standards because it extended more than 50 feet from the shoreline. My dock was exactly 48 feet long. I'd measured it myself. But here's the thing about fighting bureaucracy. The truth doesn't matter if the paperwork looks official. And this paperwork looked very official, complete with surveyor reports, environmental impact studies, and community petition signatures. I was still reading when my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw Mike Reeves from down the street, holding an envelope and looking like someone had died. "Mike, what's going on?" He handed me the envelope without making eye contact. "Sorry, Robert, I didn't want to be the one to do this." Inside was a single sheet of letterhead from Pine Grove Community Legal Services, a law firm I'd never heard of. The message was short and sweet. "Mr. Patterson, you are hereby notified that your continued harassment of community volunteers and security personnel has been reported to local law enforcement. Any further attempts to interfere with lawful community activities will result in formal charges being filed. Please govern yourself accordingly." "Mike, what the hell is this supposed to mean?" But Mike was already backing down my driveway. "I'm sorry, man. They said if I didn't deliver it, they'd start looking into my shed permit." His shed permit. These people were threatening building permits now. I watched him hurry back down the street, and that's when I saw them. Little clusters of neighbors standing in their driveways, all holding identical envelopes. The Clark sisters hadn't just targeted me. They'd sent their legal threat to everyone who might support me. The message was clear: help Robert Patterson, and we'll come for you next. By 6 o'clock, my phone had stopped ringing entirely. People I'd known for 3 years suddenly couldn't return my calls. The neighborhood group chat that used to buzz with everything from lost cats to borrowed lawnmowers had gone completely silent. I was sitting on my deck, watching the sun set over a lake I could no longer access, when I realized something that made my blood run cold. This wasn't about my dock at all. The emergency meeting was set for 7 p.m. at the community center, but by 6:30, cars were already circling the parking lot like vultures. I sat in my truck for a few minutes, watching my neighbors file inside. The same people who used to wave at me every morning, now avoiding eye contact like I had some contagious disease. The community center smelled like stale coffee and floor wax. Folding chairs had been arranged in neat rows, facing a card table where the Clark sisters sat like matching bookends. They had changed out of their yellow rain jackets into identical navy blazers, but their smug expressions hadn't changed a bit. "Good evening, everyone," Debbie called out, tapping a small gavel on the table. "Thank you for coming to this emergency session of the Pine Grove Homeowners Association. I took a seat in the back row, and I swear I could feel the entire room tense up. Mrs. Henderson actually scooted her chair away from me. "Before we begin," Donna added, "we want everyone to know that tonight's meeting is being recorded for community safety purposes." She gestured to a small camera on a tripod, its red light blinking like a mechanical eye. Everything they did was being documented. Everything I did would be too. "As you all know," Debbie continued, "we've had some unfortunate incidents this week involving threats and intimidation of community volunteers." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Threats and intimidation? I'd asked 2 simple questions and shown my federal badge. The individual in question has used his former government position to try to bully our security personnel and interfere with lawful community activities. Former government position. She made it sound like I was some kind of disgraced ex-politician instead of a retired federal inspector. "Now, we want to be fair," Donna said, looking directly at me. "So, we're going to give Mr. Patterson a chance to address the community directly, to explain his actions and apologize for any distress he's caused." The room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. 40-some pairs of eyes turned to stare at me. These were people I'd helped jumpstart their cars, people whose mail I'd collected when they were out of town, people who'd borrowed my tools and invited me to barbecues. Now they were looking at me like I was the neighborhood predator. I stood up slowly, my knees creaking in the sudden quiet. "Well, I appreciate the opportunity to speak, but I think there's been some confusion about what actually happened." "No confusion at all," Debbie interrupted. "We have witnesses." "Witnesses to what, exactly? Me asking why you were putting a sign on my dock." "Witnesses to you threatening our security team with federal intervention," Donna said. "Witnesses to you attempting to intimidate community volunteers with your former law enforcement credentials." The way she said "former" made it sound like I'd been stripped of rank for misconduct. The room was eating it up. I could see heads nodding, neighbors whispering to each other. "Look, all I did was show my retirement badge and ask what was going on. That's not a threat." "The badge wasn't the problem," Debbie said, standing up behind the card table. "It was what you said afterward." What I said afterward? I tried to remember every word of our brief conversation, but it had been such a surreal morning that details were already getting fuzzy. "What exactly do you think I said?" Debbie pulled out a small digital recorder and set it on the table. "I think we should let the community hear for themselves." My stomach dropped. They'd recorded our conversation. She pressed play, and my own voice filled the room. "Then you know I'm not someone you want to mess with." In the context of this meeting, surrounded by suspicious neighbors, those words sounded completely different than they had that morning. They sounded like a threat from a man with government connections and too much anger. "You see," Donna said, stopping the recording. "Clear intimidation using federal authority." But that wasn't the whole conversation. Where was the part where I asked about the ordinance? Where was their laughter when I showed them my badge? Where were their smug comments about expecting me to try that little trick? "That's not the complete recording," I said. "You edited out—" "Mr. Patterson," Debbie cut me off, "are you now accusing community volunteers of fabricating evidence?" The room rustled with uncomfortable energy. Accusing them of editing the recording made me sound paranoid, desperate, like someone who couldn't accept responsibility for his actions. "I'm just saying that conversation lasted a lot longer than what you just played." "The relevant portion speaks for itself," Donna replied. "Federal intimidation of community volunteers." Tom Bradley, who lived 3 houses down from me, raised his hand. "Maybe we should hear what Robert has to say about the dock situation." Thank God. At least one person was willing to listen. "The dock is mine," I said. "I built it on my property with my own money. I have the receipts, the permits, everything." Debbie smiled. "Mr. Patterson, when did you last verify your property boundaries?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, when did you last hire a licensed surveyor to confirm where your property actually ends and community waterfront begins?" The question hit me like cold water. I'd never had my property surveyed. When I bought the house 3 years ago, the realtor had pointed to the existing dock and said it came with the property. I'd assumed that meant it was legal. "The dock was here when I bought the house," I said weakly. "That doesn't make it legal," Donna replied. "The previous owner built that structure without proper permits, extending well beyond his actual property line." She unfolded a large map across the card table. As you can see from this professional survey conducted last month, your property line ends approximately 15 feet from the current shoreline. 15 feet? That would put the entire dock on community land. But something felt wrong about this. Why would they survey my property last month? How did they even know to look? That's when Mike Reeves stood up from the middle of the room and raised his hand. I have something to say. Mike Reeves cleared his throat and looked around the room like a man walking to his own execution. His hands were shaking slightly as he reached into his jacket pocket. I work for Henderson Survey Company, he said quietly. I've been doing boundary surveys around the lake for the past 6 months. The Clark sisters exchanged a quick glance, but their expressions didn't change. They'd been expecting this. Mike, Debbie said sweetly, we appreciate your professional expertise. Would you like to explain to everyone how property surveys work? But Mike wasn't looking at the Clark sisters. He was looking directly at me, and his face was pale as paper. Robert, I'm sorry. I should have told you this weeks ago. He pulled out a manila folder from his jacket. The survey they're showing you isn't complete. It's missing 3 pages. The room went dead silent. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to stop humming. What 3 pages? I asked. Mike opened the folder with trembling fingers. The pages showing the original 1963 Army Corps of Engineers boundary markers. The ones that established this entire lake as Federal Water Reserve territory. Federal Water Reserve. The words hit the room like a bomb. Donna Clark stood up so fast her chair fell backward. Mr. Reeves, you're out of order. This is a community meeting, not a... The whole lake is federal property, Mike continued, his voice getting stronger. Every single dock, every boathouse, every waterfront structure around this lake was built on federal land without proper authorization. The room erupted. Neighbors started talking all at once, voices rising in panic and confusion. Mrs. Henderson was clutching her purse like someone might steal it. Tom Bradley looked like he'd just been diagnosed with cancer. That's impossible, someone shouted from the front row. We have deeds. We have mortgages. Mike nodded grimly. You have deeds to the upland portions of your properties. But when the Army Corps of Engineers created this lake in 1963, they retained ownership of all land within 200 feet of the high water mark. 200 feet. I started doing quick math in my head. My house was barely 150 feet from the water. Why are you telling us this now? Demanded Janet Morrison, whose lakefront gazebo had probably cost more than most people's cars. Mike looked directly at me again. Because they knew. The Clark sisters have known about the federal boundary for months. They've been buying up lakefront properties through shell companies, planning to flip them to the government for cleanup compensation. Debbie Clark's composure finally cracked. You have no proof of any such scheme. Actually, I do. Mike pulled out a thick stack of papers. Copies of every property transaction in Pine Grove over the past year. 18 lakefront properties, all purchased by subsidiaries of Clark Family Holdings at below-market prices. The room exploded again, but this time the anger was directed at the Clark sisters. Neighbors who'd been glaring at me 5 minutes ago were now turning on the women who'd been running their community association. You bought the Hendersons' place? Someone yelled. And the old Patterson cottage? Wait, what Patterson cottage? I asked. Mike winced. Your house, Robert. The Clark sisters bought your mortgage from the bank last month. Technically, they own your property now. The floor seemed to drop out from under me. That's impossible. I never missed a payment. They purchased the note, not foreclosed on it, Mike explained. Perfectly legal. Banks sell mortgages all the time. Donna Clark had recovered her composure and was tapping her gavel furiously. This is all irrelevant speculation. Mr. Reeves has no authority to... Actually, he does. The voice came from the back of the room. A woman in a dark blue windbreaker was standing in the doorway, holding up a leather badge wallet. Agent Sarah Chen, Environmental Crimes Unit, Federal Bureau of Investigation. The room went so quiet you could hear people's heartbeats. Agent Chen walked down the center aisle, her footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. We've been investigating reports of fraudulent environmental impact claims and illegal property acquisitions around federally protected waterways. She stopped directly in front of the Clark sisters' table. Ladies, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit mail fraud, wire fraud, and violation of federal environmental protection statutes. Debbie Clark's face had gone white as chalk. This is harassment. We demand to speak to our attorney." "You'll have that opportunity," Agent Chen replied calmly. "Right now, I need both of you to step away from the table and place your hands behind your backs." But Donna Clark wasn't going quietly. She lunged for the digital recorder, probably trying to destroy the evidence of their edited conversation. Agent Chen was faster, grabbing Donna's wrist before she could reach the device. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," Chen said. That's when I realized something that made my blood run cold. If the Clark sisters owned my mortgage, and if my house was built on federal land, and if they were being arrested for fraud, where exactly did that leave me? Agent Chen must have seen the look on my face because she turned to address the room. "For everyone wondering about your property status, we'll be conducting a complete title review for all affected parcels. Until that's complete, nobody moves, nobody sells, and nobody gets evicted." Nobody gets evicted, yet. As the Clark sisters were led away in handcuffs, 40-some neighbors sat in stunned silence, all of us realizing the same terrifying thing. We were living on borrowed time in houses that might not legally be ours, on land that belonged to the federal government. And I was the only person in the room who'd spent 30 years working for that same federal government. Guess who they'd be looking at when they needed someone to blame? The community center emptied out like someone had pulled a fire alarm, but the conversations outside were hushed, desperate whispers instead of normal chatter. I watched through the windows as neighbors clustered in small groups under the parking lot lights, everyone looking like they'd just been told they had 6 months to live. Agent Chen approached me as I was gathering my things. Up close, she looked tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from working too many cases with too few resources. "Mr. Patterson, I need to speak with you privately." Here it comes, I thought. The part where they explain that my federal pension doesn't protect me from prosecution for living on illegal property. Am I under investigation too? "That depends," she said, pulling out a small digital recorder of her own, "on how honest you're willing to be about what you knew and when you knew it." We sat down at the abandoned card table where the Clark sisters had been holding court 20 minutes earlier. Chen pressed record and stated the date, time, and our names for the official record. "Mr. Patterson, when did you first become aware that your property might be built on federal land?" "About 10 minutes ago, when Mike Reeves opened his folder." "You never researched the property boundaries during your home purchase?" "I hired a standard home inspector. He didn't mention any federal jurisdiction issues." Chen made a note on her pad. "What about your background? 30 years as a federal water resources inspector. Didn't that experience raise any red flags about lakefront property?" And there it was, the question I'd been dreading. "Agent Chen, I inspected commercial waterways and industrial discharge points. I never worked on residential property issues or Army Corps jurisdiction. But you understood federal water law. Enough to know I should stay away from it in my personal life." I leaned back in the folding chair, suddenly feeling every one of my 58 years. Look, when I retired, I wanted nothing to do with federal regulations or government oversight. I bought a house by a lake because it was quiet and peaceful. "Quiet and peaceful," she repeated, "until the Clark sisters showed up." "Until this morning, yeah." Chen stopped the recorder and looked at me for a long moment. "Robert, can I call you Robert? I'm going to be straight with you because I think you're getting screwed here just as much as everyone else." That wasn't what I'd expected to hear. The Clark sisters didn't just stumble onto the federal boundary issue. They had help, inside help. What kind of inside help? Someone with access to Army Corps historical records. Someone who understood federal property law well enough to structure a complex real estate fraud scheme. Someone who could navigate the bureaucracy and file convincing paperwork. My stomach dropped. "You think it was someone from my old department?" "I know it was someone from your old department." Chen pulled out a thick manila folder. "James Morrison, your former supervisor at the Federal Water Resources Division. He's been consulting for Clark Family Holdings for 8 months. Jim Morrison. I'd worked under him for 12 years before he took early retirement 2 years ago. He'd helped me navigate the paperwork for my own retirement, recommended the real estate agent who'd found me this house. The real estate agent who had assured me the dock was legal and properly permitted." "Jesus Christ," I whispered. "Morrison knew about the federal boundary before you even bought your house. He steered you here deliberately." "Why? What was the point?" Chen opened the folder and showed me a list of property transactions. You were the credibility anchor, a retired federal inspector living peacefully on lakefront property. If the boundaries were really a problem, surely someone like you would know, right? I stared at the paperwork, feeling sick. So other people bought houses here because I was already here. 17 families, Robert. They used your reputation and your federal background to convince neighbors that the properties were legitimate. I thought about Tom Bradley asking my opinion about his dock extension last year, about Mrs. Henderson wondering if her new boathouse needed special permits, about all the times neighbors had deferred to my supposed expertise on waterfront regulations. I'd been a walking, talking advertisement for the Clark sisters' fraud scheme, and I hadn't even known it. There's more, Chen continued. Morrison has been feeding the Clarks information about upcoming federal land reviews. They knew the Army Corps was planning to reassess this entire watershed next year. They were trying to buy up as many properties as possible before the boundaries became public knowledge. So they could what? Sell them back to the government? Environmental remediation contracts. When federal land gets returned to government control, someone has to manage the cleanup, the demolition, the restoration. Clark Family Holdings was positioning itself to win those contracts. The scope of it was staggering. They'd been planning to destroy an entire community just to profit from cleaning up the mess afterward. Where does that leave everyone else? The neighbors who bought houses in good faith? Agent Chen's expression softened slightly. That's complicated. The federal government isn't in the business of throwing families out of their homes, but we also can't ignore violations of federal land law. What about my mortgage? If the Clark sisters owned my loan and they're under arrest? All Clark Family Holdings assets are frozen pending investigation. That includes your mortgage note. She closed the folder. Technically, you can't make payments to them even if you wanted to. So, I was living in a house I couldn't legally own, on land that belonged to the federal government, with a mortgage I couldn't legally pay, held by criminals who were now in federal custody. Have you ever felt like you were drowning in paperwork? I asked. Chen almost smiled. Every day of my life. That's when we heard the shouting outside. Through the community center windows, I could see neighbors arguing in the parking lot, voices getting louder and more desperate. Someone was yelling my name. Not in a friendly way. The shouting was getting closer to the community center doors. Agent Chen stood up and moved toward the windows, her hand instinctively reaching for her service weapon. "Stay here," she said, but I was already walking toward the entrance. Through the glass doors, I could see about 15 neighbors gathered in a tight circle, and they were all looking at the community center like it was on fire. Tom Bradley was in the center, gesturing wildly with his hands. "This is his fault," Tom was yelling. "He knew. He had to know." Mrs. Henderson was nodding vigorously. 30 years as a federal inspector, and he just happens to buy property on federal land? Come on. I pushed through the doors and walked into the parking lot. The group fell silent for about 3 seconds, then exploded all at once. "You son of a bitch!" "How long have you been planning this?" "Did you get a kickback from Morrison?" The accusations hit like physical blows. These were people I'd helped with their gardens, people whose snow I'd plowed last winter, people who'd invited me to neighborhood barbecues. "Everybody calm down," I said, but my voice sounded weak even to me. "Calm down?" Janet Morrison stepped forward, her face red with rage. "My husband lost his job because of this investigation. FBI agents raided our house this morning." That stopped me cold. Janet Morrison, Jim Morrison's wife, the woman whose gazebo I'd complimented just last month. "Janet, I had no idea Jim was involved in any of this." "Bullshit!" She was shaking with fury. "You worked together for 12 years. You telling me you never talked shop, never shared information?" The crowd was getting closer, forming a tighter circle around me. I could smell the fear and anger coming off them in waves. "You recommended our real estate agent," Tom Bradley said accusingly. "You told us this was a safe investment." "I told you I liked the neighborhood. That's not the same thing as—" "You vouched for the property values," Mrs. Henderson interrupted. "You said lakefront was always a good bet." Had I said that? Probably. It was the kind of throwaway comment you make at a block party, not investment advice. But they'd trusted me, because of my federal background, because I seemed to know about water regulations, because I was the kind of person who checked paperwork and followed rules. "Look, I understand you're upset. Upset? Janet Morrison laughed bitterly. Upset doesn't cover it, Robert. My kid's college fund was tied up in our house equity. My husband's pension is frozen pending investigation. We might lose everything because you and your buddy Jim decided to play games with federal property law. I wasn't playing games with anything. I bought one house and minded my own business. Then explain this, Tom Bradley said, pulling out his phone. Explain why the FBI has records of you visiting Morrison's office 6 times in the past year. 6 times? I'd visited Jim exactly twice, once to drop off a retirement gift, once to ask about fishing spots around the lake. Tom, I don't know what records you're talking about, but building security logs, Robert. Federal building on State Street. You badged in 6 times to visit Morrison's office between January and August. The crowd was getting uglier. Someone behind me muttered something about federal conspiracy and inside job. I could feel the mood shifting from anger to something much more dangerous. That's when Agent Chen appeared beside me. Everyone needs to step back, she said calmly, but her voice carried the kind of authority that made people listen. Are you arresting him too? Janet Morrison demanded. Mrs. Morrison, I understand your frustration, but Mr. Patterson is not under arrest. He's cooperating with our investigation. Cooperating or confessing? Someone called out from the back of the crowd. Agent Chen pulled out her badge and held it up. Federal investigation, people. Anyone who interferes with a witness or attempts to intimidate someone cooperating with law enforcement will be charged accordingly. The crowd started to disperse, but the looks they gave me were pure poison. 3 years of neighborly friendship had evaporated in the space of 2 hours. Robert, Tom Bradley said as he walked past me, you better hope the FBI can protect you, because when people start losing their houses, they're going to remember who told them this was a safe place to live. The parking lot emptied out, leaving just me and Agent Chen under the harsh fluorescent security lights. Those building security logs, I said quietly. I was never in Morrison's office 6 times. I know. Morrison was using your old federal ID to access the building. He never turned in his credentials when you retired, said he needed to clean out his office files. My federal ID, the one I'd reported lost 8 months ago and had replaced. He stole my identity to access federal records, and to make it look like you were actively involved in researching the property boundaries. Chen pulled out her car keys. Robert, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think very carefully before you answer. I waited. Do you have anywhere else you can stay tonight? Family, friends outside the area? The question hit me like ice water. You think they'll come back? I think 40-some people just found out they might lose their homes, and they're looking for someone to blame. Your neighbors have decided that someone is you. I looked back at the dark community center, then toward the lake where my house sat like a target in the moonlight. For 30 years, I'd been the guy who followed the rules, checked the paperwork, and trusted the system. Now the system had chewed me up and spit me out, and the only thing standing between me and a lynch mob was one FBI agent who couldn't stay with me forever. Agent Chen, I said, what happens if the federal government decides to reclaim this land? She was quiet for a long moment. Honestly, everyone gets relocated, the houses get demolished, the lake gets restored to its natural state. And the people who lived here? They file claims for compensation and hope for the best. Hope for the best. That was government speak for, you're screwed, but we'll try to make it sound official. Standing there in that empty parking lot, listening to the distant sound of my neighbors' cars driving away, I realized I had a choice to make. I could run away, let the FBI handle everything, and spend the rest of my life wondering if I'd been a coward. Or I could fight back. But fighting back would mean taking on the federal government, a corrupt conspiracy, and an entire neighborhood that now saw me as the enemy. Thing is, I'd been fighting bureaucracy for 30 years. And I was just getting started. I didn't go home that night. Instead, I drove to the 24-hour diner on Route 9 and sat in a corner booth with my laptop and 3 cups of coffee, doing what I should have done 3 years ago. Real research. The Army Corps of Engineers keeps meticulous records, and when you know how to navigate federal databases, you can find almost anything. By dawn, I had a complete picture of Pine Grove Lake, and it wasn't what anyone expected. The lake had been created in 1963. That part was true, But the federal boundary didn't extend 200 feet from the high water mark, like Mike Reeves had claimed. It extended exactly to the original surveyed shoreline, which put every house in the neighborhood on legitimate private property. Morrison and the Clark sisters had been running a double con. They'd convinced neighbors the federal boundary was smaller than it actually was, then convinced federal investigators it was larger. Both sides thought they were getting screwed, when the reality was that most of the properties were completely legal. Most of them, but not all. Agent Chen found me at the diner around 7 a.m., looking like she'd been up all night too. "Figured I'd find you here," she said, sliding into the booth across from me. "Coffee? You look like you need it more than I do." She signaled the waitress. "We arrested Morrison at his house 3 hours ago. He's talking, trying to cut a deal." "What's he saying?" "That the whole scheme was the Clark sisters' idea, that he was just providing research services, that he had no idea they were defrauding property owners." She rubbed her eyes. "Standard federal contractor defense. I was just following orders." I turned my laptop around so she could see the screen. "Agent Chen, what if I told you Morrison was lying about more than just his involvement?" She squinted at the survey documents I'd pulled up. "What am I looking at?" "Original 1963 Army Corps Boundary Survey. The real one, not the version Morrison provided to your investigation." Chen studied the screen, then looked up at me sharply. "This shows a completely different boundary line. The federal jurisdiction ends at the dam structure and the original creek bed. Everything else, all the houses, all the docks, the entire developed shoreline, is legitimate private property. That's impossible. Our entire case is built on federal land violations. Your entire case is built on falsified survey data that Morrison provided." I pulled up another document. "Here's the chain of custody for the boundary records your office received. Morrison submitted them as newly discovered historical documents last month." Agent Chen was staring at the screen like it was showing her cancer results. "You're telling me there was never a federal land violation issue?" "I'm telling you, Morrison created a fake federal land issue to justify the Clark sisters' property grab, then used that same fake issue to trigger a federal investigation that would freeze all the properties they were trying to acquire." The waitress brought Chen's coffee, but she didn't touch it. "If you're right, then we've been investigating a crime that never happened while the real crime was happening right under our noses. The real crime was mortgage fraud, pure and simple. The Clark sisters bought up property notes using falsified environmental reports, planning to foreclose when the fake federal investigation tanked property values." Chen pulled out her phone. "I need to call my supervisor." "Before you do that," I said, "there's something else you should know." She looked at me warily. "The community meeting last night, when Mike Reeves stood up and confessed about the federal boundary, that wasn't a spontaneous outbreak of conscience." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I called Mike yesterday afternoon and told him exactly what to say." Agent Chen set down her phone very carefully. "Explain." "Mike's been surveying properties for the Clark sisters for months, but he never knew about the mortgage fraud angle. When I figured out what was really happening, I needed a way to expose the whole conspiracy in front of witnesses." "So you coached a federal witness?" "I gave a scared surveyor the courage to tell the truth instead of letting him stay quiet and collect his paycheck." Chen was looking at me like I'd just admitted to murder. "Robert, do you have any idea how many federal crimes you may have just confessed to?" "Probably fewer than Morrison and the Clark sisters committed." I closed my laptop. "Agent Chen, your investigation is about to fall apart. The federal land violations don't exist. The environmental crimes were based on falsified reports. Even the conspiracy charges might not stick if Morrison can prove he was just providing research services." "What's your point?" "My point is that you need a new case, one based on actual crimes with real evidence and genuine victims." "Such as?" I pulled out my phone and showed her the banking app screen. "Such as the fact that I've been making mortgage payments to Clark Family Holdings for 6 months, even though they never legally owned my mortgage note." Chen frowned. "How is that possible?" "They've been intercepting payments and depositing them into accounts they controlled, while the actual mortgage holder, First National Bank, has been reporting me as delinquent." That's wire fraud, mail fraud, banking fraud, identity theft. I smiled for the first time in the 24 hours. And I can prove it because I kept every receipt and every confirmation number. Agent Chen stared at me for a long moment, then started laughing. Not happy laughter, the kind of exhausted, slightly hysterical laughter that comes when you realize you've been chasing the wrong case for months. "You know what the really funny part is?" she said. "What?" "If you just stayed quiet and let us investigate the fake federal land case, Morrison and the Clark sisters probably would have gotten away with the real crimes." "Probably. Instead, you figured out the whole scheme and handed us a better case than we started with." I sipped my coffee and looked out the diner window at the sunrise over the lake that had caused so much trouble. "Agent Chen, I spent 30 years watching bureaucrats and criminals hide behind paperwork and regulations. Sometimes, the only way to get justice is to make them think they're smarter than you are." 3 months later, Morrison got 5 years in federal prison. The Clark sisters got 7 years each. Every neighbor in Pine Grove got clear title to their property and compensation for the emotional distress caused by the investigation. I kept my house by the lake, but I had to build a new dock. The old one got destroyed during the FBI evidence collection process. Something about needing to examine the support pilings for environmental damage. These days, when I sit on my new deck with my morning coffee, I watch my neighbors wave as they walk their dogs or tend their gardens. We all went through something together: fear, anger, uncertainty, and came out the other side as better neighbors than we were before. But I learned something important during those dark days when everyone thought I was the villain. Sometimes the only way to clear your name is to risk everything you have left. And sometimes when the system fails you, the best thing you can do is use your knowledge of that system to fix it. After all, bureaucracy isn't just a weapon. In the right hands, it can be justice too.